Again, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever in the world you are joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us for Insignia's latest webinar, Preparing to Respond to a Data Breach. It's the third webinar this year on a cyber theme, and the reason for that is that the previous two were so popular and so well attended, I think unsurprisingly so, that we felt there was value in doing a third webinar on this topic, but from a slightly different perspective, and on this occasion with a guest speaker. So we're going to chat for 45 minutes or so, and as ever, if you have questions, please post them via the questions pane, and we will endeavour to pick up those at the end. First of all, some introductions. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We work with the leaders of businesses around the world to help them do and say the right things on the worst days of their business lives. And sadly, these days, that certainly includes cyber incidents. In fact, in the top 10 of scenarios that we're preparing, I would say without any shadow of a doubt, cyber incidents come in at #1 at the moment. And I guess that's no surprise, because they can affect every kind of organisation, and that's why there's such a diverse range of people and organisations on this call. Joining me this afternoon is Jim Stephen, who is Head of Crisis Recovery Services at Experian, and Jim will be talking to you particularly about when and how to communicate in response to a cyber crisis. Clearly, we always say that responding effectively to a crisis is about doing the right thing and saying the right thing, and both are of equal importance. If we look way back into history, in the UK, the TalkTalk, the telecoms operator there, data breach, they came out and communicated really quickly. But of course, the armchair critics criticised them for not being able to answer all of the questions that they were asked. Compare that with Yahoo, who were more tight-lipped about the cyber attack they were subjected to, and the penalty for that was a reduction in the value of the acquisition that was made of Yahoo subsequently. So there is an extent to which you are damned if you do and damned if you don't with regards to communication following cyber breach. And I'm sure one of the things that Jim will be saying is that there are no absolute right or wrong answers. You've probably heard enough from me already, so I'm going to hand over to Jim. Jim, as I say, is the Head of Crisis Recovery Services at Experian. Jim, perhaps if you could just talk a little bit more about your background and the work that you do, and then we'll have a look at a couple of contextual slides before me throwing some questions to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So hello to everybody, and Jonathan, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So yeah, I've been Head of Crisis Recovery at Experian now for getting on for 9 years, and that's predominantly around the consumer recovery actions, and we'll kind of go into that shortly, but that's really around how we help organisations notify data subjects, so the individuals who have been compromised, how we support and reassure those people in terms of inbound communication as well as outbound, and then the various mitigations that follows. Previous to that, I spent 20 years in the security industry. That was across corporate, aviation, and then more latterly, it was in sort of challenging environment and oil and gas protection services. So this is a lot more hygienic, and the quality of the hotels that I visit is an awful lot better. So effectively, what I'm going to try and do today is just give you some insight into what we're seeing in the market, why it's increasing, and hopefully just give you some tools just to think through and talk back to your own teams around what areas we can provide some enhancement on that consumer response for you.
Thanks, Jim. A quick heads up for everyone. First of all, this session will be recorded, so you can forward it to colleagues. We'll be dropping a line to you afterwards. There'll also be the opportunity to download this, which is an infographic which talks about some of the key things that it's helpful to do beforehand, and both Jim and I will share our contact details at the end. So without any further ado, Jim, talk to us about, as this slide says, how is the cyber landscape, and in particular, the impact of ransomware evolving, please?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I thought the introduction was interesting because when we go back in time and go back 5 or 6 years, actually the number of events that were happening were still fairly low. And 2021 was really where a large number of things changed, and predominantly ransomware was one of them. We'd seen the evolution of WannaCry a couple of years earlier, particularly on people like the NHS, which was really the newsworthy area. But effectively, ransomware really came into its own in 2021, and that was with organisations producing bespoke ransomware attack propositions that they use to access the market. 2022, a lot of people looked at the Ukraine war, as well as coming through and into cost of living, that was one of the reasons why we saw a decrease in ransomware. But actually what we started to see at the end of 2022 and really in full force now in 2023 is the evolution of ransomware. And what we've really seen is the productization of ransomware. So in 2021, criminal gangs worked collegiately with a criminal supply chain in the areas that you can see on the graphic on the right-hand side. And I'll talk you through that very briefly, but effectively what was happening was you would have a ransomware gang, someone like Conti, someone like Black Cat, someone like ReEvil, and what they would do is they would go out to the market on the dark web and they would find partners. And these partners would specialize in the areas here. So a number of you may see different ransomware as a service execution models. This is my version. So it doesn't link to IT security. This is just the modules that we're seeing in the marketplace. And what was basically happening was gangs were going out saying, this is who we'd like to attack. Can you build me a phishing email so that I can gain access into their network? Once I've got in, I'll go out to the market again and see if I can find someone that's able to do reconnaissance once we've got in to look for lots of information relating to their target. And then once we've deployed the ransomware and we've got information, we can then start to utilize that information through harassment to get payment. So it was quite a simplistic process, but a really clever, if you like, supply chain execution model. What's actually transpired over the last 2 years is I don't call them criminal gangs anymore. I look at them as organizations that are built with hundreds of people and work with supply partners that evolved from those early, if you like, ransomware on a bespoke basis. What they've now done is started to build and productized all the elements of these modules. And the reason they've done that is because they can attack lots more organizations. But what they can also do is attack a far greater degree of organizations. So what they can look to do is move from big corporates right down to SMEs, so right down to small and medium enterprises. And effectively, they can also, it dramatically shorten the timeline between infiltrating the organization, deploying the ransomware, and getting through to the payment. So that used to take up to a year in 2021. Now it's about a 3-month, if you like, sales cycle. And whilst the return on investment is perhaps more moderated, so back in 2021, we were probably looking at initial ransom demand somewhere around 10 to 20 million, but they were looking at a 20% settlement value on that. What we're now seeing is a much more realistic value, where they've got a couple of different flavors of product that have got different suggested return on investment models for the cost, i.e. the ransom payment. And what this has done, this landscape and the speed at which it can be deployed, activated and finalized, is really what's generating the huge boom that we've seen in the tail end of 2022 into 2023 in the form of ransomware attacks. Because now it can be deployed faster and to a much broader community. And they've got supply partners who have looked and improved and enhanced each aspect of the module. So there are now 2 or 3 flavors of phishing intrusion. Scouting information will tell you if they've got cyber insurance. It will tell you who the insurer is. It will tell you what limits they've got on various policies. It will also give you customer supply lists. It will give you client supply lists. It will give you telephone numbers. It will give you email addresses. They will have organizations now that are very used to contacting and reaching out to organizations to tell them that unfortunately one of their customers or suppliers have suffered a ransomware attack, and that unfortunately their data is caught up in it, and if they don't help them get them to pay it, then their data may be caught up in it. And it is the utilization of personal identifiable information, so consumer information, that helps amplify that message and put pressure on organizations to pay the ransom. And really, what we've started to see is the faster you can deploy and the more pressure you can put on organizations to pay faster, that in turn leads to the fact that it's very difficult for organizations within a much shorter time window to know exactly what data is compromised, but knowing if they don't tell someone, either the regulator and or the data subject pretty quickly, that effectively the story can get ahead of them. And it is that time pressure that really allows the if you like, the ransomware teams to really command why they're getting that return on investment. It's the pressure line and the fact that organizations are desperate to tell regulators and desperate to tell data subjects, so the individuals concerned, because they feel it's the right thing to do. And they're preying on that to get those payments. So I'll just pause there, Jonathan, just so that you can perhaps just what if you had any questions, or indeed anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, you've almost answered this question in what you've just said, Jim, but I wondered if you are seeing trends in how and when people are communicating, specifically driven by the different dynamic and pace that ransomware has brought.
So I think the challenge with ransomware is you will be contacted pretty quickly by that organization to tell you you have suffered an attack. And the forensics teams will be able to tell you pretty quickly that that is indeed the case. And you may get or may require some proof of theft. But again, that can normally be provided pretty quickly. So the problem is you become aware that you are potentially compromised very quickly. And under GDPR, you have 72 hours to tell the regulator once you become aware of an attack, especially an attack that involves personal identifiable information. And therefore, that already has organizations concerned that they may not exactly know what data has been compromised, but they do know it has been compromised. And then you've got the challenge, which is they all desperately want to tell people and be seen to be doing the right thing. And certainly regulators want organizations to tell people as quickly as possible. But they may be at a point where they don't even know who is compromised. And then you've got the challenge with these organizations of, do we tell everybody? Or do we wait and try and find out what data has been compromised, so that actually when we're providing that information, we're providing it to the people whose data has been compromised. So you've got this kind of dichotomy of, do I tell everyone now we seem to do the right thing, or do I wait and get a bit more information so that actually I can target that communication, and I can do that so that I'm helping the people that need help and not worrying people unnecessarily. But at the same time, in the background, they know that the ransomware teams are going to be going out and trying to amplify that message in an open environment to try and get the media involved, try and get third-party law firms involved to put additional pressure on you to settle.
Yeah. And what do you think stakeholders expect these days? It's always easy to perceive a situation from your own perspective when you have been attacked as an organization, and we know that kind of looking inwards is the wrong thing to do in a crisis. It is looking at the stakeholder impact rather than, you know, oh, woe is me, we have been attacked as an organization. So if you're in the stakeholders' shoes, what do you think people expect these days when their data has been compromised?
So I think if you're looking at what consumers expect to be notified literally as soon as you know.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the reality is you don't know that their information has been compromised. You don't know what level of information has been compromised. And so you have this balance to strike, which is, I want to tell them as quickly as possible, but I want to give them as much of the full picture as I can. You know, so is it just a hashed password and an email address, or is it all of their financial information? Because those are two very, very different things. And it could be you go out and tell everybody they've lost everything.
Yeah.
And the reality is 1% might have lost certain packages of information, but actually 99% have just lost an email address. Still bad, but effectively, are you at heightened risk of identity theft? And so it's, do you wait and give the people the right information? And you mentioned it earlier, are there any right or wrong answers? No, there are just consequences for which forks in the road you decide to take. And it's understanding the consequences that's the key.
Yeah. Okay. So building on that, Jim, again, you've just said it, in crisis management, decision making is critical. It's the decisions that you make that will determine the ultimate impact on both you and your stakeholders. But in my experience, there are no easy decisions in a crisis. If they were easy, people wouldn't trip over themselves from time to time. And every decision, whichever route you take, usually brings downsides. There are cons with every decision that you make. In this instance, around, you know, when to communicate, and do you communicate quickly but without full information at the risk of maybe over exaggerating the problem, or do you wait and then be criticised for not releasing it? What are the considerations that organisations should factor into their decision making before someone actually has to make that call?
I think there's a couple of things, and actually the interesting piece is it comes back to really a basic premise, which is, if I was going to communicate tomorrow, can I even do that? Do I even know how I could communicate? There is an assumption, particularly by boards, and it's typically a board that you will be speaking to when an incident like this occurs, where they say, we're just going to tell everyone straight away. We've decided we need to tell everyone, we want to tell people. And it's at that point you say, but have you even got contact information?
Yeah.
And there's well, of course we have, we must have. And it's actually then, well, how easy is it to access at the moment? How badly are your systems compromised? Are you actually, you know, the amount of clients I have to speak to on Gmail because their online work emails are not working? You know, so there is some constraint around well, where are you? They will still be going through e-discovery with the forensics firms. They will still be speaking to their lawyers. Lawyers will be putting legal privilege around them. Lawyers will be speaking to the regulator and letting them know where they are. They might be turning to some crisis PR teams to help them start to understand what they're looking to do around stakeholder management, internal and external communication. All these things are going on at the same time, and they're saying, and we know we're going to need to have to tell people. There's a whole series of competing priorities, and which do you do first? And I think the challenge for a lot of, especially boards where they are used to making lots of decisions, is there are so many decisions and they're all now concertinaed, whereas a few years ago, actually there was an orderly line that you could almost go in. Now everything's hitting all at the same time. So you are really starting to say, do we listen to the lawyers and do what the lawyers say, or do we wait for the forensics, or do we start to get ahead of the story with crisis PR, or do we actually start to look at how we're going to tell people and what we're going to say and how we're going to say it and where we're going to say it? And so that's probably where I would start to look and go, it just becomes overwhelming. And actually, it's getting them to understand it is overwhelming, and working with organisations. You almost work with your specialist partners to say, I know you want to tell people quickly, but let's just break this down into an orderly route as much as we can.
Yes.
And that's really the key. The key is, okay, we know we want to tell people, we hear that. First of all, what are the legal people saying? What are the forensics people saying? Let's get a status report. Could we go out and tell everyone? Yes, you could. How many people is that? 2 million. Are they likely to be all affected? We're 90% sure they're not, but at what point do you want to make that call? And then how quickly could comms be drawn up? And then how quickly could we be able to disperse that messaging? And all those things, they'll start to understand how long those things take. And it's at that point they start coming to say, myself, going, okay, from a logistics perspective, what does that look like? And then I then add additional steps into that will either frustrate, but a lot of the time there's a rationale for that, which is, well, is it postal? Is it email? Is it, how are you going to do it? Have you got that information? And that's where you start to go down and start to identify how you're going to do things.
And of course, it is implicit in what you're saying, but I think it's worth making it explicit that this is why planning, preparing, training, rehearsing is so important. It's always been important in crisis management, but I think particularly when you're talking about this very shortened time frame and the amount of damage that can be done by a cyber attack, actually covering off both the logistics, so how are you going to execute your response beforehand, rather than, as you described, Jim, finding out that you haven't got all of the contact details that you need, but also rehearsing your decision making, which we were just talking about, doing some scenario planning. If this were to happen to us, in principle, what are the parameters that we would apply to make our decision? And in principle, what would that decision be? At a simplistic level, are we ethically or morally against paying a ransom under any circumstances, or is it under some circumstances, or is it, if that's the right answer, that's definitely what we will do. But you don't want to be finding out you can't contact people when the breach has happened, and you ideally don't want to be beginning your decision-making process when the situation has occurred. You want to have considered that beforehand. There's another question actually on decision-making, Jim, that I don't know if you can talk to, but it's, could you talk about how threat intelligence can be used to inform the crisis management team's decision-making?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as close to it as others, but if you're looking and have some form of threat detection, and it depends kind of what threat detection you have, whether that's kind of more IT forensic based, so looking at anti-intrusion, etc., or it's seed data that you've provided to a specialist that's actually looking for whether it's activism or criminality and how that's kind of manifesting itself in the dark web or in other kind of data sources. That will start to give you intel around this has happened. Is this information for sale? This is where your kind of proof of theft type information is, because most of the time, can you stop attacks? You can stop some attacks. Can you stop all attacks? At the moment, no. I don't think there's anyone brave enough to say that you can stop everything. So on the basis someone's going to get in and they can get things out, you're monitoring then to see, well, where is that information surfacing anywhere? That will start to just give you a sense of who you're dealing with. That will also give you a sense on, and certainly the forensics type people, as well as the lawyers, will have a decent understanding of how certain organisations, whether it be Conti or Black Cat or whoever, how they work, and how, as scary as it sounds, how reliable they are. How much do they value the quality of their product?
Yeah.
And they want to assure you that if you do pay a ransom, that you will get back that you have lost. Because obviously they want to make sure that you have confidence in your product, in their product, which is terrifying to say, but increasingly that's what we see. So is it useful? Always useful. And the more information you've got, the more your decision can be evidence-based. And I think that's, yes, absolutely. So doing those things and investing in those things, like anything, really useful. And I mean, I am fortunate in the sense that I don't have to answer the really difficult question of do you pay a ransom or not?
Yeah.
It's very easy to say you should never pay a ransom. The reality is if you're a CEO or you're a board and you turn over £10 million a year and you've employed a number of those people that work for you over many years, and you know that this particular event could sink your business, and by paying £100,000 it can go away, it's a difficult decision. And that is not an easy decision in any way, shape or form for people. So it's understanding the pros and cons of paying a ransom versus not, understanding that if you're not, at what point do they start leaking information, and at what point can you start communicating with people?
Great. And again, I always think it's interesting to understand as far as you possibly can how the stakeholders who are affected by your crisis are feeling. And with that in mind, can you talk us through, in your experience, what do different types of stakeholders tend to actually be most concerned about when their data has been breached? Because I know from a previous conversation we had, sometimes it's not what you might expect. I'm thinking particularly of airlines, for example, but there may be other examples whereby what the organisation may believe stakeholders are concerned about actually isn't their biggest concern.
Yep. So, I mean, I think it's interesting with the companies that have suffered the breach. For them, it's always going to be about how it affects revenue, how it affects consumer confidence, how that then affects things like churn, etc. I think for the consumer, what's interesting, and you touched on hospitality. So if you look at airlines, hotels, where we've seen those types of industry impacted in the past, and they've lost personal information. So just think whenever you check in, either to an airport or a hotel, you provide them quite a lot of personal data. You would think people would be really worried about the amount of personal data, whereas actually a lot of them are worried about their loyalty programs. So are they worried that a lot of them, where we've dealt with all these types of organizations, the calls that came in, the big concern from those types of organisations was, have I lost my lounge access? Have I lost my free upgrades? Have I lost free Wi-Fi? How does this impact the fact that I had all these bonus points and I was planning a family trip next month or in 3 months' time? And actually, that a lot of the time leads to a lot more calls coming in that we would anticipate. So normally, calls coming in, I would expect somewhere between, I don't know, 1% and 3% of the affected base would call in after receiving something, depending on the level of data exposure. But where it's something like that, if that's more emotive to them and they're more terrified about losing lounge access or business class upgrades or superior room upgrades, that is a much bigger motivator for them, and you will get more calls as a result. And they're much more churn bias type of businesses. There are other, competitors that you can easily move to. So it doesn't take much for those people to start moving across. So it's quite interesting in that regard. It's looking at the emotional side of it. So where you're looking at older demographics and it's financial information, have they got more to lose? Are they more motivated to phone you? If it's health information, how do different people feel about health information? It's these.
You've suddenly appeared on screen, Jim.
I know.
A nice surprise.
But there you go. So I might turn it off I didn't want to scare everyone. So, but effectively, that's the piece that I would look at. I would look and say, what are the motivations? What's unique about your business? How are your customers going to react that's different? If it's, say, an e-commerce company and it's clothing, how will they react? What if it's a recruitment, or you have lots of recruitment information? So you could be a big multinational that hires around the world. How does that impact? Are people going to phone up to say, you've lost my information, I'm terrified? Or are people going to phone up to say, am I still in line for that job interview? And it's starting to understand that, so that when you're actually looking, and I've got it on the next slide in a bit more detail, that just talks around, think through your notification considerations when you're sending out the notifications, but understanding whatever you send out is going to generate a form of inbound communication in response. And understanding that better, and understanding what you think your customers are going to ask other than, can you give me more information? Is this real? Has this actually happened? Should I be worried? That starts to give you an understanding of, okay, let's try and understand how we can best reassure those individuals with this particular type of communication. So getting the communication is really important. So, for example, if you've not lost any financial data, tell them that you haven't. Because the one thing that will put people at ease is if you absolutely know you haven't lost financial data, telling them will calm a lot of people down. Not telling them will have a lot of people still thinking, well, have they? And that will generate uncertainty, worry, inbound communications. And so when you're trying to understand how you would revert and respond to that, the more you can think that through, and we appreciate this is in a very condensed timeline, but the more you can think that through, the better the consumer response will be. And that's where we sit down with organisations and say, right, let's look at how and what type of questions are they going to fire back. And our experiences with this industry type, these are some considerations. What's the average age of the demographic?
Carry on, sorry.
No, you go, Jonathan.
No, I was going to say, we're naturally talking about consumers a lot. What are the differences or nuances, if there are any, for organisations which don't deal with consumers? They're not a business to consumer organisation, they're business to business, or a big corporate, or an NGO. what you're saying relate to those that don't deal or sell to the public?
Yep. So it's really interesting. If you look at the cohort groups that we typically see in most event recoveries, they fall into kind of 6 categories. So you have staff and ex-staff, as well as consumers and ex-consumers. You also have active pension scheme members, and then you have contractors and suppliers. So even if you're just a B2B business, you already tick 4 of those 6. So you're going to have staff, you're going to have ex-staff. You know, you will be legally obligated to keep ex-staff information for a period of time. And where you've got a pension scheme, you've got people on that pension scheme. And then you've got contractors and suppliers. So you still hold those people. And what's really interesting of those cohort groups, the ones that cause the most difficulty are ex-staff. They're the ones that are most likely to call in. They're the ones that are most likely to have gone to third-party law firms to look at options around compensation. They will be the ones that utilise that wording. So actually, you're still going to probably have to decide, are you going to craft a single communication, or are you going to start to look and say, actually, do we need to build out bespoke communications to different cohort groups? And I think that's one of the challenges that lots of organisations face, because when they come to me, they say, well, it's just going to be a communication and we'll get our PR and our internal comms team on it. And then you suddenly sit there and go, okay, but let's just take brass tacks and say, you're going to do that by email or letter? And they all say email because it's the cheapest and quickest way to do it.
Yeah.
But then you ask the quick follow-up question, which is great. Have you got email addresses for everybody? Now, ex-staff typically won't give you an email address. You may have a forwarding postal address, but you probably utilise their work email. So suddenly you're looking, going, actually, I'm already going to have to do 2 different mechanisms. You're also looking at the quality of that data and saying, do we even know if that's up to date? You know, they left 4 years ago. So do I need to clean that data? You know, when organisations phone me, say on a Sunday night and say, this has happened, can we get the communication out on Tuesday? You sit there and say, how clean's the data? It's going to take 2 days to clean it. It could be you hold duplicate data. In fact, the average duplicate size is around about 15%. So 15% of all data we're given is normally duplicated.
Right.
And then you sit there and go, so we'll take those out, but then are they still living at the same address? Because the problem with the pandemic was, as soon as the pandemic lifted, everyone moved house.
Yes.
So you've still got that consideration. Have I still got the right address, or do I need to get the data cleaned? And, you know, we would use something like a raw mail forwarding address to get you the new address because we have consent to do that. Sadly, you're going post-pandemic, you've also got to carry out mortality checks.
Yeah.
You're also, so you're looking at, well, we need to clean it, make sure that we've got the right group. That takes time. Then you're going, well, some of them's email, some of them's letter. There's a natural stagger between those 2. This is assuming that all your customers, all your staff are all in the same country. But what if you've got German, you know, what if you're a split organisation and you know, post-Brexit have now got an operation in Germany and an operation in the UK? You're then having to craft communications in German and in English.
Yeah.
So suddenly, even for a B2B business, you've got email and letter, 2 templates. Staff and ex-staff, 2 more templates. So that's 4. German and English, that's 8. So you're creating 8 templates out of nothing. I mean, if you then do the same thing, but with consumers, email and letter, 2, staff, ex-staff, consumer, ex-consumer, pension, contractor, 6, that's 12. And then you're running that in 3 jurisdictions, Germany, UK and France, that's 36 templates. And you're needing privacy lawyers to approve the actual content for each jurisdiction. And suddenly what was a really simple, we just want to send a communication out, can you get it done by Tuesday, changes to, you need to clean it. We can start on Monday, it's done by Wednesday. Then you've got to send over everything. Emails 3 working days, postals 5 working days to actually start sending the things out. And you've got to get all of the content approved by your legal teams, your compliance teams, stakeholders, and it's got to be translated, and it's got to be looked at by different privacy lawyers for those jurisdictions. Suddenly you're going, well, how long is that going to take? And everything starts to elongate. And
so
that's
sometimes
where,
it's not just an unwillingness to communicate; it's an inability to communicate. Simply don't have the tools.
And I think that's exactly. That's the challenge. Is you start singing Craig David songs about getting a call on Sunday and what happened, and effectively it's the appreciation, and you suddenly see the light dawning on the teams of, hang on a minute, this isn't just an IT issue where I just need to mail merge in a set of email addresses. It's now more complicated that I've got different groups with different contact information. I've got different cohort groups that need to be contacted in different ways. I've got different risks potentially with those cohort groups. So we talked about hospitality. What if it's staff and ex-staff? Are you going to be worried about the same things that you're worried about with the gold card members, or the elite group of customers that have had your loyalty cards? It suddenly says, actually, therefore, on the inbound communication, do I need different communications? Do I need different telephone numbers? Yeah. And actually, if it's international, how easy is it to get an international telephone number, or a toll-free or a local rate number? And in certain jurisdictions, it can take 6 weeks.
Right.
China, 6 weeks, you've got to have an entity there, you've got to have a named person, you've got to have utility bills. There's a whole series of, depending on where you operate, there are questions and there are delays. There are ways around these things, but all of this is happening all at the same time, and you've got that ransomware group sitting there saying, we're just going to keep releasing things unless you pay. But if you pay, it all goes away. That's the challenge with ransomware. It's a really difficult decision for lots of people to make. And I'm just talking about the consumer recovery. You're still having the legal conversations. You're still having the forensics conversations. And you're still working out what impact that's going to have on the reputation of your business.
Yes.
As well as how it's affecting your churn rate. You've still got business as usual things to do. But now you're trying to do this. And there are just a series. And as I say, when the slides come out to everybody, there are just some things to think about, both from a notification and a call center perspective. And you can start to look at how that manifests. There you go. I won't go through all this, but it starts to give you an understanding of what I've just spoken about and the things you need to think about. You know, we talked about fragmentation, we talked about templates, we talked about multilingual capability, we talked about where attacks happen, how attacks happen. And, you know, this was without even looking at, say, do you tell everyone at the same time? Or do you stagger the communication? The bigger it is, you don't want everyone calling in at the same time or having inbound communication. You know, what's worse than being told some bad news and you're worried is then you try and speak to the organization about it to get more information and you can't get through because you told everybody at the same time and everyone has sent their inbound communication at the same time. So do you have
We've
to
also
stagger?
seen examples of websites crashing, haven't we? There's, you know, with the FAQs on it and get your help here, but then for exactly the reason you described, that website crashes, which then becomes a further negative part of the story. It's a big challenge.
It's you know, so do you get ahead of things like that? And that's where the planning comes in, right? It's do you look at building out microsites that you've got dormant that you can activate in the event? That's where you put your FAQs to take pressure off the main sites. Do you actually have worked out a stagger strategy that says, actually, I'm on slightly different time zones in the places I operate? So I might want to tell everyone at 9 o'clock in the morning, but the good news is 9 o'clock in the morning is different according to where you are in the world. Do you tell cohort groups at different times? Do you tell people that have got different products? Or do you wait for information to come back that says, actually, based on e-discovery, these people are at really low risk. They've only lost an email address.
Yeah.
And these people are at really high risk, and they've lost all of their personal information. So they're at really high risk. And then you've got a grey area in the middle. So you might actually decide you don't need to notify the people at the bottom end, and it's only then the top end, and then in the middle, you then make that call. And the hardest call is normally the grey area call. But having thought through all of the things that you're seeing here, if we needed to communicate, can we? If we're going to do that, is it on the same platform? Do we need that information? Can we delete information we don't need anymore? Is probably the single biggest bit.
Yeah.
You know, that's key. You know, if you don't need it, delete it. But have a plan around, we know we're going to probably get this many calls in. Can we manage that in-house, or do we need to outsource it, or do we need an overflow, or do we need to set an email address up or a microsite up? How do we manage these things? And on managing that, are there things that we think people are going to ask that are more business relevant than personal information or event relevant, i.e. going back to hospitality?
Yeah.
Is there questions that we can give them, that we can send through to the app, that they'll all have on their phone, that perhaps give them the reassurance that way that we can do on outbound messaging? It's having that kind of ability before a crisis to think that through that makes it 10 times easier when you're in one, which, you know, will be echoed by all, you know, yourself, Jonathan, and specialists in all of the other disciplines that we've talked about today.
Excellent. As we go into the final 10 minutes, if anyone has any questions, please drop them in. We've got a few already, and I'll put one of these now, Jim, and then maybe we'll move on to your summary slide. But please, everyone, if you do have questions, post them. So someone's asking, in your experience, are organisations more or less likely to communicate quickly these days?
I think so companies want to communicate more these days.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, companies have always cared about their customers, and they want to tell them the information. I think in the, as dare I say it, the good old days of crime, when a server was stolen or information on a server was stolen, you knew what server, and you quickly were able to find out what information had been compromised. You could work together almost like on a waterfall basis and say, right, we'll do that first, then this, and you could control the go live date. And it was just much. Now the problem is you're in agile. You're having to do everything at the same time, and you don't have all the answers. And that's, I think, what causes the concern for organisations, is they're just not in control in the way they used to be, and that's deliberate because ransomware gangs want a ransom. And keeping you off balance is the best way to do that. And that's the whole purpose of ransomware for them. Keep you off balance, pay. And then it all goes away. And I think we now see organizations increasingly have much more robust IT infrastructure, and they are much better with disaster recovery, i.e. getting back online. Sadly, most of the conversations I have around consumer recovery, there is no plan in place. Right. And it's not something they've thought through. And it's not something where they've actually decided. When you talk to them about stagger strategies, for example, they will say, can we just get everything out in the morning? I don't mind you staggering over 2 hours. The problem is you sit there and go, it's 1 million people. You need to think about it over 2, 3, 4 days, because otherwise the number of calls that can come in could overwhelm you, or even if you're outsourcing it, the demand spike that generates is enormous. Are your customers going to get the relevant level of reassurance that you want them to get?
Yeah, and again, this comes right back to one of the first things I said, that, you know, effective crisis management is about doing the right thing and saying the right thing, and that needs to be simultaneously. And you might have the most brilliant technical fix, the speediest technical fix, but if you're not communicating effectively in parallel, there can be just as much damage to the organization than if you hadn't been able to fix the problem. And so you're so right, it's not just about being technically ready, it's about being ready to communicate. There's another question, Jim, come in, and then we'll go to your summary slide before I do some housekeeping at the end. So from Ben, is there a risk of opening yourself up to further attacks by communicating quickly and revealing gaps in the system?
Yes, is the sad answer. I mean, look, there's risk in everything. There's risk of communicating quickly. There's risk that if you pay the ransom, that everyone knows that you paid it and they'll come after you again, which is why people tell you not to pay it. There is risk in delay. I mean, I've had companies take a year to tell data subjects. And I've had companies tell people 24 hours. And neither of those are they always bad outcomes? There are just different consequences. And so does that, you know, by putting information out early, does that open you up? Yeah. And you will typically see that once someone's had a system compromise, you will then see a flood of attacks following in. And a lot of the time, it's not pure criminality. It's almost people wanting to get a badge to say, oh, I managed to get into them as well. And you'll see a wave. So your IT teams will typically see a bigger increase in people trying to access systems after an event like that's been published. So these are consequences. Now, you've actually got most organizations have really built up their IT defenses and have got really good disaster recovery. And, you know, CISOs work incredibly hard to make sure that they're as secure as possible and effectively understand those types of things are going to happen. And that's why there's just no easy answer. And I'm afraid, yes, there's a consequence, but then there's equally a consequence of not doing that.
And again, I'm just going to beat the same drum, which is to say, think through the consequences of different courses of action and different decisions ahead of time, and work through which are the negative consequences you are more comfortable in living with, rather than having to do that when you'll be, you know, in one of the most pressurized days of or even weeks or months of your business career. Think it through when you're not under that pressure. And secondly, yes, this is very simplistic and maybe a little bit trite, but nevertheless, it's true and it's important. When making those decisions, absolutely do what is in keeping with the values and the culture of the organization. Certainly your stakeholders will be judging you in terms of how you respond, and are you responding in a way that aligns with how you've positioned yourselves, the promises and expectations that you've set? If all else fails, use your values. In fact, more than if all else fails, as a starting point, use your values to guide that decision making. Jim, I'm going to have to rush us through the final 5 minutes. There's a summary slide from you that I think is worth whizzing through before I do my wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully a lot of these things have echoed through. So, I mean, and actually, Jonathan, the piece that you put there, I would link also to culture and values. And making people aware of everything and having them buy in is also really key. And I always talk about this in the sense of the British Isles, is all it needs is one rowing boat to land on the shore, and then they're in. And it's a really difficult for, you know, if you've just got your IT department that are responsible for covering the whole coastline. Whereas at least if you've got all the employees looking for it, the better your training, the better the culture, the better the support. We talked about data. If you don't need it, don't keep it. And as I say, I think people have listened to the IT infrastructure message. And I think we've talked around playbooks and understanding the pros and cons. But the more you do that and the more you understand that, the easier it will be. And then practice it. And practice it in different formats and different scenarios, but use the team and get the team together so they understand how to work with each other and what's expected of each other. And the big thing is there's lots of specialist partners out there. You know, we're one, Jonathan, yourself, but you will have legal panels, you will have forensics panels, a number of you will have cyber insurers. You can have free calls with all of those. We'll all jump on a call and chat through things with you, but build up those relationships. You know, there are people like me that are doing this every day. If we can give you some insight that just help you prepare better, you know, that should be the responsibility we all have, is to help you, you know, regardless of whether you need services from us or not. I'll always commit. If you ever want to pick the phone up and chat through with me, I'll always take that call.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to just do a summary before thanking you and bringing the session to a conclusion. So, couple of offers from Insignia. First of all, if you haven't taken our crisis readiness test, and if you'd like to benchmark how well prepared you are for a crisis, there'll be a link to complete our 10-minute online scorecard in the follow-up email to this session, which will also include a recording of this session. Next month, we're going to look at reputational risk. We've done 3 sessions on cyber risk. There's also this really growing and potentially devastating risk area of behavior, ethics, morals that fit into this category of reputational risk. So we're going to take a look at that next month. As in all of these webinars, I also wanted to offer a copy of my book, Crisis Proof, to 3 people from this webinar. So in the email which comes out after this session, there'll be an invitation to simply drop me a quick email saying you'd like to be included in the draw for the book, and your name will then go into said draw, and we'll be sending 3 of those books out subsequently. Finally, I'd like to thank Jim so much for sharing his expertise. This is a critical area of cyber response. As Jim himself said, the disaster recovery is so important, but it's only half of the job. Communicating with your stakeholders, and it's not just consumers, as we've heard, it's employees, ex-employees, pension funds, the whole shooting match. So Jim, thank you so much for sparing the time. And as Jim also said, he and I would be very happy to be contacted with any further questions, either immediately after this session or subsequently. But yeah, thank you for your expertise, Jim. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. I hope you found this afternoon's session stimulating, enlightening, and interesting. Really appreciate you sparing the time. As I say, there'll be another one in June. So look forward to seeing you for that session, and I wish you a happy and crisis-free afternoon. Many thanks, everyone.